Alright, the glossary. I already did Principality of Gallia. Gallia's history. The nation was formally born in the 3rd century, when Castle Randgreaves was built and rule over surrounding areas began. When the Empire invaded Gallia at the turn of the 19th century, the king renounced his crown, instead ruling over an autonomous region within the Empire as Archduke. But as democratic movements swept Western Europa, the Archduke harnessed that energy in Gallia to push for freedom from the Empire, resulting in the War of Gallian Independence. Stretched thin between multiple fronts, the Empire was unable to maintain its hold, and the small nation rose as the independent Principality of Gallia, declaring neutrality and establishing a system of universal conscription. With the sea at its north and west, and thick forests shielding it to the south, Gallia is naturally fortified against invasion, historically allowing it to repel even significantly larger foes. Hilly plains cover 60% of the nation's land, and its mountains contain a rich store of Ragnite ore, a valued source of energy. Large cities dot the flatlands to the north, while the rest is largely occupied by lush farmland. Gallia enjoys a temperate oceanic climate with little variation in rain levels throughout the year, and the soil is highly fertile. Because growing conditions for livestock and grain are equally favorable, Gallia practices a mixed form of agriculture. Brule. This small town lies on the imperial border at the eastern edge of Gallia. Windmills stand atop the crests of many of the region's rolling hills, but few are as large as the so-called sister mills, built from an old castle tower in the heart of the town. Because it radiates out from the mill, Brule is also known as Miller's Home. The town supposedly began as a hideout for Royal Guard soldiers who'd revolted against the king. Perhaps an echo of that, this town of just under 8,000 nonetheless is an active town watch, and Brulers are famed for taking pride in guarding their homes themselves. Exports include dairy and bread made from locally grown wheat. The capital city Randgreaves. The capital of Gallia, since its days as a monarchy, this ancient city has the longest history of any in Europa. The city takes its name from the ancient war hero who founded it and began rule over the surrounding area, the ancestor of today's House Randgreaves. Surrounded by castle walls stretching 1 kilometer in diameter, the entire city stands as a citadel and contains the seat of Gallia's politics, economy, and culture. Castle Randgreaves, home to the Archduke, marks the iconic heart of the capital. Its single magnificent tower has been likened to a unicorn's horn, giving rise to the national crest that bears the likeness of the mythical beast. Military headquarters. The Gallian army's central base stands amid a wooded area at the outskirts of the capital, known informally as Fort Amatrian, in honor of General Amatrian, who was responsible for restructuring Gallia's military and establishing this facility during EW1. Within its walls lie the Army's command room, offices, training grounds, hangars for weapon storage and maintenance, and other military facilities. It also holds living quarters, a mess hall, infirmary, and a relaxation lounge for the soldiers themselves. Even R&D work on inventing new weaponry takes place in an on-base facility, with mechanics and engineers hard at work there around the clock. The Great Vassal Bridge. This massive iron drawbridge spans the Vassal River, which flows into Lake Graz near the walls of Castle Randgreaves. The bridge has its origins in the late medieval era, when it was built with 2 towers at either bank as part of a ring of defensive installations around the capital. A 19th century renovation saw it made into a retractable drawbridge with a unique accordion fold design that allows it to be operated by extending and retracting a single pair of cables. The city of Vassal grew out from either side of the bridge, prosperous in its role as a transit gateway between the Gallian capital and the outside world due to its key position on both ground routes and a series of canals connecting it to the North Sea. The Cloden Wildwood. This expansive primeval forest stretches across Gallia's south, forming a natural border with the Empire. Poor roads, violent peaks and valleys, and extremely dense vegetation combine to impede travelers while baffling their natural sense of direction. Thought to be impenetrable except by foot, Cloden has been a living fortification against invasion since Gallia's inception. The woods are home to foxes, squirrels, and rabbits, as well as larger animals like deer and boar, and rarities such as the porcavian. Beeches form the majority of this deciduous forest, also rich in elm and oak. Untouched by human hands, some of Cloden's trees are thought to be over 1,000 years old. The Citadel at Gerlandio. Massive and stalwart, this fortress sits on the Gallian imperial border. Built in the Middle Ages as a castle along the key route linking Gallia to eastern Europa, it now stands as a modern fortress. Following EW1, it served as a checkpoint controlling the flow of people and goods into and out of Gallia. At the onset of EW2, Imperial forces claimed it for use by Commander Maximilian and his top echelon officers as a base of operations for the ensuing large-scale invasion. After claiming the Citadel, the Empire outfitted its facade with powerful fixed cannons and began to use the structure as a storehouse for weaponry to be used in the Gallian incursion. The Barious Desert. An arid desert devoid of all vegetation covers the eastern Gallian basin area, several tens of kilometers across. Allegedly scorched as a result of the so-called Darkson calamity, the area has been reduced to a huge, uniquely shaped crater with a host of deep crags issuing out from a massive gulch at the basin's center. Thought to be the result of a massive explosion, these fissures in the ground match standing rock formations full of large, circular holes. The remnants of human dwellings dot the eroding landscape, suggesting that this area was once the site of a large city. These days, violent sandstorms assail travelers, and visitors to the region are few. Barious Ruins Antechamber. The structures found across the Badlands and the temple at the crater's core are collectively called the Barious Ruins. The main temple, said to have been built by the ancient Valkyria, was constructed using giant slabs of Ragnite-rich stone in an architectural style found nowhere else in Gallia. Inside, the walls of the antechamber are inscribed with a history of the Darkson calamity and the War of the Valkyria, written in Old Northern script. Decorated with a motif believed to be a representation of the Valkyria people known as the Valkyrian Spiral, the Grand Hall also holds a door leading down into the Inner Sanctum, closed tight to bar the entry of all outsiders. Barious Ruin Sanctum. Undiscovered until quite recently, the Barious Temple hides within it an inner sanctum, thought to be accessible only to descendants of the Valkyria. The interior takes the form of a massive spiral staircase winding down over 50 meters below the surface around a large column. Along the outer wall, further writings etched in a ceremonial script detail the truth behind the War of the Valkyria. As immigrants from the north with advanced Ragnite technology, the Valkyria easily defeated the indigenous Darksons and succeeded in the conquest of Europa. The Barious Temple served to disseminate a false history to the masses, while the truth of what happened was passed down to their descendants alone. Fosen. As one of Gallia's richest mining sites, this industry capital grew hand in hand with the evolution of Ragnite science. The city is divided between an upper and lower level along either side of a steep ravine that locals have chiseled away at for decades to create the present slope. The city's layout allows for Ragnite ore to be mined, extracted, and sent on to manufacturing along a smooth, logical flow. Trolley cars stationed throughout the area carry the excavated ore to a refinery where it can be extracted, then sent on to one of several manufacturing plants to be made into weapons. Following the Empire's occupation, the manufacturing process's labor needs were met by Darkson later camp detainees. Darkson Concentration Camp. Darkson laborers collected during Imperial hunts were held in this Fosen prison facility. After capturing Fosen, the Empire was faced with the task of staffing its ore mines, smelting facilities, and arsenals with laborers. Hunting parties were sent to scour Gallia for Darksons that were abducted and used as slave labor, made to live in a shoddy wooden camp on the ravine floor while working under inhumane conditions. A high-voltage electrical fence surrounded the camp's perimeter to prevent escape, and Imperial soldiers kept a close eye on the detainees from atop watchtowers built throughout the area. The Marbury Shore, one of several stretches of open shore north of the Fosen industrial region. The Empire turned the sheer cliffs that surround the broad, hilly center of the inlet into an extremely effective stronghold. Massive cannons and thickly shielded machine gun emplacements lined the rock face, barring all entry, while fortifications carved directly to the cliffside further contributed to making this base utterly unassailable. This bloody beach marked the end of the road for countless Gallian soldiers sent in the many attempts to oust the Empire from the area, each of them failing to breach the base's ironclad defenses. The Magyar Plains. Few areas within Gallia have been the ground for more battles through history than the sweeping Magyar Plains, found in the nation's northeastern region. As the object of several border disputes between the Empire and Gallia, this area saw warfare so frequent that today only a few scraggly patches of grass remain to cover the divot-ridden red clay soil. Trenches dug during EW1 also remain, crisscrossing the region in a complex network of deep scars. As a resource-rich part of the largest landmass in the Northern Hemisphere, this land has inspired those with dreams of domination for millennia. In ancient times, the Valkyria managed to unite Europa under their rule, giving rise to a number of kingdoms. Subsequent divisions arose as influential leaders within each of the kingdoms chose to splinter off to form new nations, and it was not long before the first campaigns of conquest began. By the 1800s, the balance of power lay split between the East European Imperial Alliance and the Atlantic Federation, with the small nations in their shadows left to weather the waves caused by the clash of these two behemoths. East European Imperial Alliance, a conglomerate of nations united under the rule of the East European Emperor, commonly referred to as the Empire. The Industrial Revolution that occurred when Ragnite was discovered as a useful energy source saw the nations of Eastern Europa, pioneers in machine technology, rise to power. Already tightly bound by a network of marriages amongst their royalty, these nations now joined hands in a formal international alliance. While not technically an autocracy, the Emperor enjoys limitless authority within the alliance. The Empire retains customs and practices held over from medieval times, and its people are known to harbor conservative views, including a strong hatred for the Darkson race. Atlantic Federation. The product of an alliance among a large collective of West European democracies, known informally as the Federation. Popular uprisings, spurred on by the late 18th century Industrial Revolution, gave birth to a number of new democracies. The nascent empire, formed to the east, represented a common threat, motivating a mutual defense agreement among these infant republics. Though an elected head councillor acts as the Federation's chief executive, unanimous agreements are rare among the constituent republics, meaning it often takes months to enact measures. Though a series of secret alliances and gains won by extortion and blackmail put the Federation ahead of the Empire in terms of national power, they have yet to defeat them on a field of war. European Calendar. This calendar, used across Europa, has at its origin the Valkyria conquest of the continent. For this reason, it is also known as the Valkyrian calendar. Each year is counted in relation to the year the Darkson people were subdued and Europa was united as a continent. Years predating the unification are denoted as BC, or before conquest. The First European War. Friction between Federation and Empire surrounding Ragnite resources escalated into a continent-wide war, EW1. The Industrial Revolution of the 18th century led to skyrocketing demand for Ragnite. pitting Europa's twin giants in a race for resources. When the crown prince of the empire was assassinated at the start of the 20th century, tensions spiraled into all-out war. Though the imperial force employed a corps of newly developed tanks, hostilities soon became bogged down in fruitless trench warfare, and the two exhausted powers ultimately signed a ceasefire agreement. During the war, Gallia's military, led by General Belgian Gunther's tank corps, foiled an imperial invasion attempt. The Second European War. Beginning as an imperial incursion into Federation land, EW2 quickly engulfed the entire continent in what became the largest-scale war in Europa's history. Though EW1 ended in a stalemate, both powers had spent the intervening years stockpiling arms and preparing for the inevitable return to hostilities. After a short 20-year pause, the Empire began the invasion anew, taking 3 of the Federation's border republics in quick succession. The Federation responded with a formal declaration of war. It wasn't long before the forces of both superpowers began to spill across the borders of other neighboring nations. Soon, all of Europa was caught up in a war that dwarfed all those in memory. The War of the Valkyria. The ancient Valkyria united the European continent after subjugating the Darksons in this half-legendary war of conquest. By Circa 30 BC, the Darksons are said to have ravaged much of Europa, wielding the dark arts to harness the destructive potential of Ragnite in their heedless power struggles. Suddenly, an immigrant population known as the Valkyria emerged from the north, bearing a divine power in the form of the lances and shields bathed in blue light. Using those to halt the Darkson rampage, they brought peace to Europa, according to inscriptions found in ruins across Europa. In addition to unifying the land under their rule, the Valkyria are credited for the birth of modern European culture. Old Northern Script. The written form of Old Northern, the lingua franca of Europa following its unification of Valkyria rule. It uses a set of characters comprised of vertical, horizontal, and angled strokes no longer legible to most contemporary Europans. Inscriptions on the monuments discovered across the continent suggest that the script served as both a tool of everyday communication and in rituals. It has been shown that Valkyria royalty and members of the high clergy used a ceremonial variant of the script, though surviving examples are extremely rare. The ancient Darksons were also thought to have their own written language, but no material evidence remains today to support that theory. The Darkson Hunts. A common term for the systematic capture of Darksons, practiced most frequently in Eastern Europa. Continuing the long history of prejudice and persecution against Darksons that dates back to the War of the Valkyria, the Imperial Army often staged hunts. Captives were alternatively used as slaves or simply executed. Hunts also performed by dedicated squads whose sole job is to scour settlements from both Hunts are performed by dedicated squads whose sole job is to scour settlements both within the Empire and abroad for Darkson captives. The increased need for labor brought on by the onset of war saw hunts grow both more frequent and violent. Victims were sent to live and work in inhumane squalor at any of several concentration camps across Europa. House Randgrise's secret. The original ancestors of House Randgrise were actually a powerful clan of Darkson natives who had ruled portions of Europa before the Valkyria invasion. When the Northerners arrived, this clan chose to betray their race by aiding the Valkyria conquest. In return, the Valkyria granted the clan a city-state to rule, today Randgrise, and made them the Valkov's keepers. The Darkson traders subsequently claimed to be Valkyria themselves, writing their betrayal out of history. The Valkov was sealed away as a pillar of a castle tower, while the truth about House Randgrise was buried even more thoroughly over centuries of ruthless suppression of any knowledge about a historical event. The Valkyria. These immigrants from the north are said to have united the devastated continent under one rule in ancient times. Though believed to be an oceanic tribe that crossed into Europa via the Northern Sea, much of their historical origin remains unproven by archaeological fact. Their Ragnite weaponry allegedly granted them unparalleled power over the Darkson natives, though other accounts suggest that their very bodies exuded a strange blue light that allowed them to perform superhuman feats. Where historical fact ends and legend begins, no one can say. By the end of the 2nd century after the conquest, interbreeding with the native population is thought to have all but ended the pure Valkyrian bloodline. Darksons. Europa's oldest indigenous race, said to have lived across the continent since ancient times. They are characterized by dark blue-black hair and shawls bearing the traditional Darkson pattern. History tells of a Darkson calamity, in which this race devastated the continent until the Valkyria defeated them in the War of the Valkyria. For their crimes of senseless destruction, the Darkson were stripped of their last names and chased from their jobs and property, and remained the targets of hatred and persecution. Recent use of Darkson labor to mine and smelt Ragnite in refinery sites full of pungent oils has given rise to a new set of stereotypes. Despite endless derision and persecution, the Darksons remain a proud race with a rich, unique culture. The Feast of All Spirits. A long-standing tradition in Gallia, this festival is now an official holiday. The spirits of the earth, driven away by the Darkson calamity, were again able to return to Europa after the Valkyrian conquest. This day is said to mark the beginning of their renewed exchanges of love during the peace that followed. Major practices for celebrating the day include the exchange of gifts between lovers. In the past, presents were given to anyone the giver felt close to, but recent times have seen it become a day for couples in love to mimic the spirits in exchanging tokens of their affection. Darkson Good Luck Dolls. Traditionally made by Darkson people as gifts for loved ones, these dolls are thought to protect their bearer from harm, and are kept on one's person at all times. The human-shaped dolls, made of thatched fisher grass, wear shawls bearing the Darkson pattern. Additional clothing and facial expressions are added using scrap cloth and colored thread. Though the basic doll is of a traditional design, makers are free to add their own touches and decorations to make the gift more personal. Universal conscription. One of Gallia's national precepts states that all citizens are eligible to be drafted into service in times of war. Enacted as a way to enforce the position of armed neutrality adopted after Gallia won its independence, the law prescribes a 3-stage draft according to need, and applies to men and women alike. Schools of each level offer mandatory military education, and all citizens are required to graduate from middle school, meaning all Gallians have a basic training in combat skills. Universities double as officer training schools, and graduates are eligible for the rank of lieutenant upon enlistment. The Gallian Army. A standing self-defense force serves to uphold Gallia's position of neutrality. As every citizen receives basic military training, most of Gallia is also guarded by independent watch groups, and defensive preparations are made on a town, neighborhood, and household level. In times of peace, Gallia's army is made up of 80,000 ground units, 10,000 marine units, and 2,000 military police units in addition to the autonomous town watches found across the nation. When at war, a militia is drafted from the civilian public and assembled under that standing force, called the Gallian Army. Officers from the Gallian Army are assigned to lead militia regiments and battalions as necessary. The Imperial Army. Led by the Emperor, the Empire's politics are still largely controlled by the aristocracy. The military is no exception, with several of the highest positions held by the Emperor's blood relatives and close affiliates. Operating under a code of conduct with roots in the medieval ideal of knightly chivalry, troops are expected to give their all in fidelity to the Emperor. The Imperial Army was the first to make and employ tanks, their replacement for armored cavalry units, a development that redefined war in Europa and secured the Empire's military superiority. Gallian National Arsenal. As the nation's only arms manufacturer, the National Arsenal both develops and constructs all of Gallia's weapons. Seeing the production of arms as a part of national defense, leaders elected to end weapons importation and founded a new domestic arsenal during EW1. This also helped keep weapons technology and plans from leaking to foes. Professor Thamer, creator of the tank that war hero General Gunther operated, was a major player in the arsenal's initial staff, matched only by Bernhard Brondel in skill. Brondel, who rose to lead the arsenal, is said to have amassed his considerable knowledge through close friendships with a number of talented Darkson engineers. Tanks. At the turn of the 20th century, a time when trench combat was the primary form of warfare, these armored vehicles were created to break across defensive lines. Their design employs a Ragnoline fuel combustion engine in which energy is harnessed from the explosive ignition of liquid ragnite. Byproducts include a distinctive blue light and extreme heat, requiring the addition of a radiator at the tank's rear to prevent overheating. Originally used to cross trenches and as foot soldier support, economic and technological advances have seen tanks grow to fill a number of combat roles. After the Empire employed highly mobile attack tanks in EW1, all of Europa began to develop new vehicles, leading to the diverse array of models seen today. Galleon tanks. As part of a defensive force, Galleon tanks designs favor small, highly mobile units suited to Gallia's topography over heavy tanks focused on firepower. In EW1, the Galleon force used light tanks and foot soldiers to stop the Empire's invasion rather than squaring off against the attack-heavy Imperial tanks. After witnessing the Empire's fearsome armored core, a group of Galleon engineers led by Professor Thamer came together to develop a new kind of tank that could be mass-reduced to check the Imperial force. Thamer proposed the necessity of a line of tanks specifically in offensive power, but Galleon army leaders dismissed his ideas. Consequently, most of Gallia's tanks remain primarily defensive units. Imperial tanks. Born in the late 19th century as a means to break the stalemates of trench combat, Europa's first tanks were imperial in design and manufacture. The Empire's armored corps took to the field shortly after EW1 began as a force of extremely powerful, highly mobile tanks, easily tearing apart the Federation's defenses. In the medieval military philosophy of the Empire, the tank represented the new knight, and stood at the army's core as it marched across the continent. Unable to stand up to the Empire's tank force directly, neighboring countries were left to develop small ambush tanks, which in turn led Imperial designers to build bigger and tougher juggernauts. In the tank technology race, the Empire has long remained one step ahead. Federation tanks. Partly due to barren arsenals and a lack of infrastructure in the Federation prior to EW1, the war saw the Empire secure a broad head start in the field of tank technology. To Federation forces centered around foot soldier tactics, the Imperial Armored Corps represented a new and terrifying form of warfare. By the end of EW1, the Federation military knew well the necessity for heavy tanks with large cannons, and the development of armored vehicles began in earnest. Unable to rival the Empire in technology or military prowess, they instead chose to exercise their economic superiority, building a force of tanks with middling capabilities large enough to combat the Imperial force by sheer numbers. Equus. What's in the weapons section? Lots of stats. Imperial General Gregor personally aided in the design and development of this large armored train. Designed to fit European broad-gauge rails, the entire chassis of this Ragnite engine is plated in thick armor. It tows a massive cannon car and a heavily armored defense car, both equipped with machine guns and standard cannons. At the rear is a final command car from which Gregor presides. Installed in Fosen upon its completion, it is used to deter both enemy invasion and Darkson labor escape attempts. Batamis. Stats. This thing is extremely slow. Maximilian, the leader of the Imperial invasion, commanded this massive tank. represents the enhanced version of an existing design, created to fell enemy castles or fortresses. Upon orders from Maximilian, the body was reinforced and fitted with a Ragnite cannon, adding to its already formidable capabilities. It played heavily in the Empire's seizure of the citadel at Gerlandio. Marmota. Somehow slower? It definitely seemed to be going faster in the cutscenes. Built to Maximilian's specifications in a joint effort with the Imperial Navy, this vehicle blurs the line between tank and battleship in a new class called the Terrestrial Dreadnought. 4 engines and 2 propellers work in parallel to power this behemoth, allegedly developed as a mobile platform for the Valkov. An experimental artificial Valkyria apparatus is said to have been installed at the rear of its main deck. Valkyria Common Knowledge. Legends of the War of the Valkyria and a number of traditions that stem from this ancient people can be found in all areas of Europa, and a basic awareness of the Valkyria's existence pervades the land as common knowledge. The generally held view of this race is as saviors of the continent who led all of Europa to prosperity, with some going as far as to worship them as divinities. That said, the bloodline is believed to have died out long ago, resulting in a thinning of their presence within the popular consciousness. Today, there are many who view them less as historical fact than as the stuff of legends. Valkyria Historical Truth. The ancient Valkyria invaded Europa from northern lands known to be exceptionally rich in Ragnite, engaged the indigenous Darkson population in unprovoked combat, and ultimately subjugated them. Skilled in the use of Ragnite and genetically able to unleash the latent power within it, they used the Valkov to incinerate cities and crush the Darkson defenses. In order to justify their actions, the Valkyries shifted blame for devastating the continent onto the Darkson people. They authored a history in which they were Europa's saviors, using that as a basis for authoritarian rule. Much remains unknown about the Valkyrie, including their origins and the basis of their preternatural powers. Valkyria Worship. Some Europans hold the Valkyrie as the object of religious worship. Known to have possessed superhuman abilities, the Valkyrie are understood as either gods or the vassals of gods in several sects, the largest of them known as Yigdism. The Yigdis faith arose at the start of the 3rd century and gradually spread to all regions of Europa. Its tenets hold that the Valkyria were a race of gods, and its mythology draws heavily from the northern legends brought in during their conquest. Because beliefs have traditionally taken the form of popular superstitions tied closely to everyday practices, regional differences abound, blurring the lines between one sect and the next. The Lance and Shield. Unearthed from excavation sites across the continent, these weapons are thought to have been wielded by the Valkyrie. The shields are round, while the lances take the shape of a spiral shell, made from Ragnite more pure than even current refining technology can produce. While some variation exists among the weapon's shapes, all of them bear a design known as the Valkyrian spiral as a core motif. Because contact with the Valkyria triggers a physical alteration to the weapon's shape, they are believed to serve as amplifiers for the race's preternatural abilities. How many more are there? Okay, not too many. 6. Valkov. A massive lance-form weapon believed to have been used by the Valkyrie during their ancient war of conquest. Its core, said to be composed entirely of highly refined Ragnite, was capable of emitting an extremely destructive beam of light. After the War of the Valkyrie, the spear was sealed away inside the central tower of Castle Randgries and written out of existence. Studies performed after EW2 have suggested that the Valkov may have been mounted on a massive ark when used in ancient times. If true, knowledge of the ark may have informed the design of the weapon's modern mount, the Imperial Dreadnought Marmota, but a dearth of evidence has kept all speculation in the realm of conjecture. Ragnite. As Europa's primary energy source, this ore has become vital to daily existence. It luminesces a characteristic blue hue when releasing the energy it contains. Mined primarily in mountainous regions, the raw ore is then refined for use in any number of applications. Though the ore's existence was known in ancient times, it was not until the Valkyria brought their refinery technology to Europa that its use began. Since the Industrial Revolution, it has become a vital ingredient to human civilization. A surging need for tank fuel and weaponry derived from the ore has recently driven Europa's nations to expand their borders in a growing war for resources. Uses of Ragnite. Depending on the refinery methods used, Ragnite ore can produce various forms of energy suited to a spectrum of needs. Refined into liquid ragnoil, it can fuel lamps or power vehicles, granting it a broad range of civilian uses. Its military applications include tank fuel, an incendiary agent in flamethrowers, the explosive payload in hand grenades, and countless others. Medical scientists recently learned that the ore also acts as a painkiller, developing a controlled disinfectant and restorative agent known as Ragnade. The new properties and applications for the ore continue to be discovered daily, and few doubt that this resource will only continue to grow in use and value. Lion's Paw, a perennial plant found across Gallia, near and dear to the hearts of many as a sort of informal symbol of the nation. Distinguishing characteristics included small, white, star-shaped flowers and seed tufts often carried off by the wind like tiny snowflakes. Its leaves spread close to the ground surface in clusters, with stalks bearing the plant's flowers at their center. As an exceptionally hardy plant, they are known to thrive even under adverse conditions, weathering times of extreme hardship to bloom again the next year. Porcavians, a winged cousin to the common pig, found in wooded areas of central Europa. Generally smaller than other porcines, this subspecies is further distinguished by the wing-shaped appendages that grow from its back. Because it is incapable of flight, the biological term wing does not strictly apply. Though some have argued that its wings are an adaptation that makes these pigs better suited to life in their habitat, no convincing explanation of Porcavian evolution has emerged. Affectionate and intelligent, they are sometimes kept as pets. The biplane Isara. Pretty high top speed compared to all the tanks. Built according to design notes left by Isara's father Thamer, this bi-winged two-motored plane is comprised of a four-cockpit, horizontal wings and tail, and a vertical rudder. Isara expanded the cockpit to seat two in order to allow her brother Welkin to join her. Engines originally used in armored vehicles, but subsequently discarded by the Gallian army, were repurposed to turn the plane's twin propellers. Though aeronautics research began across Europa shortly before EW2, Gallia was not among its pioneers, so the sight of an airplane remains a rare treat. Whew, and that's all of the glossary. Finish up with this next time.